in the University of Windsor for having me. And yeah, definitely looking forward to sharing a little bit as per what we can share in the next hour. Yeah, so basically what we were covering is we'll be giving a little bit of an introduction to the journal publishing process, focusing mostly on the sciences journals because, hey, we're Canadian Science Publishing. So some tips and tricks about preparing to publish that we hope will be helpful to you. Talk a little bit about peer review in terms of what the conventions are and some of the trends that we're seeing in the field. And then talk a little bit about open. So there's open access, open science, and open data. We will define those terms and talk a little bit about what's happening there as well. I will pause a couple of times to see if we have any questions, but for the most part, we'll reserve some time at the end for Q&A, and we want to make sure that we definitely have at least a few minutes to get to that part. So who am I? Thank you for the introduction. I'm Morgan Tunzelmann, Journal Development Specialist. I've been with Canadian Science Publishing for 2 years, and prior to that, I worked with University Presses. So I have some experience in social science and humanities books, but always on the research publishing side. So I've had the opportunity to see it evolve over the past 10 years or so. And Canadian Science Publishing, in case you haven't heard of us, we are a not-for-profit. And we have a portfolio of 22 journals, many of which have been in either with Canadian Science Publishing or with societies for, in some cases, over 100 years and definitely over 50. So these are, relatively well-established journals. And then there are some new journals that we're starting up as well. The type of journals that we publish, primarily basic sciences, so things like chemistry, physics. I work on the Canadian Journal of Animal Science, Canadian Journal of Plant Science, and Canadian Journal of Soil Science, which are agriculture journals. And we have a couple of health science journals. And we do have one section in our journal called Facets, which is beginning to delve into the social sciences a little bit, but for the most part, we're very much focused on the science. Our mission to enhance the reach, rigor, and relevance of science so that people can find, trust, and use it. So to make sure what we're putting out is ethically sound and is also available to everybody who wishes to access it. So researchers across the globe, as well as researchers at institutions, and ideally whether or not they have an official subscription to the journal, that they are still in some capacity able to access our contents. Okay, so this is a bit tricky with it being hybrid, but maybe what we'll do is I'm going to ask the questions, and if you can put up your hand if you are in person, or if you're online, if you can just do a little reaction of your choice, and we'll just get a sense of who we're talking to here. So have you ever been an author on a paper submitted to a journal? Okay. So about half of you, not too many of you in the chat, just one, but a few people definitely. Have you ever been a senior or corresponding author on a paper submitted to a journal? So that would be usually the last author. No. Have you ever been a peer reviewer? Okay, so a couple of people participated in the peer review process. And have you ever been a guest editor or associate editor? So either you've been a member of a board of a journal, and you've either been a long-term member and associate editor, or you have been kind of a temporary member that is facilitating a special issue or collection. And a section editor or editor-in-chief. So this would be typically a senior academic, a decision maker. Okay, so mostly I'm guessing people who have begun the publishing process but haven't really experienced all the different facets of it at this point. So this is a great point to be learning about publishing a little bit more. Okay. All right. So science publishing can be confusing. Definitely different terms that you may see popping up, some of which you're seeing there, different acronyms that you may or may not try to wrap your head around. So we'll try to demystify some of that as we move forward. Before we move into the considerations that you might have as authors, I wanted to mention a little bit about what publishers do. We tend to find that there is perception that publishers take the free labor that peer reviewers and editors provide to their disciplines, and that we essentially put a little shine on it and put it out into the world, which is not quite true. So typically what a publisher does is we have people and we have systems, technical systems that enable the creation of a full-fledged article with all its associated metadata and its licenses, and ensuring that it is ethically sound and that it is disseminated out into the wider world and that it is preserved. So we offer things like managing manuscript submission and peer review. This is done through an automated system, but it's also done because we have staff members who will answer questions directly from the authors and from the editors themselves, and this is happening on an ongoing basis. We provide editorial and ethical oversight, so ethics in particular. This includes flagging papers that may not adhere to ethical standards, and there are a lot of ethical infringements, unfortunately, happening in the publishing sphere these days. So this could be everything from gift authorship, where someone who doesn't qualify as an author is still given credit, either because they paid for it or there's some sort of shady agreement going on there, which does happen. This can include things like plagiarism, which you all no doubt will be familiar with at this point, to cases where AI may have been used unethically and not credited. So definitely those are two of the kind of really important parts to publishing that we spend quite a lot of time managing, especially these days. Copy editing and proofreading and production and formatting. I put red brackets there because I think everybody knows that we do this. Still, it does take a lot of time to make sure that your manuscript is readable and that its citations are all correct and standardized. And then also to make sure that the article is still laid out and ready for publication. And we do this both in HTML and PDF format. Indexing and abstracting, that's when the article has all the metadata attached to it. So things like little tags reflecting what its title is, what its author is, everything from keywords to abstract to page count to and so on to ORCID ID for the authors is all attached to that little piece of information so that when it is disseminated, it can be read by many different aggregators and databases that it's going to go through. Marketing and promotion. At Canadian Science Publishing, if we have an article that is relevant to the wider society, if it is newsworthy, we will promote it. We'll often promote things like collections or special issues, group efforts too, as well as journals. So there's some effort going in there. Rights management, which is managing legal access to content to make sure that author rights are respected. And open access and subscription management. So publishers develop relationships with libraries regarding subscriptions to the journals that the libraries are subscribed to. And then as well, we do agreements with institutions that help support authors with their open access fees so that they can get discounted or even free fees and they don't have to reach into their own research budgets to pay when they submit an article, which is the ultimate goal. Archiving and preservation, very important. So managing the publishing platform to make sure that all the different components of the article, images and tables and figures and metadata remain static no matter what changes are happening in the technology. And then as well, archiving the actual work itself so that it can be used for decades, if not hundreds of years to come, no matter what happens to the publisher. Okay. So Here's where you probably are most interested in finding out a little bit more about what actually happens when you submit your manuscript. So the pathway to publishing. So we know that science articles or any research article, they're not like open platforms like blogs or social media, even though they may look very similar. So this has to do with the fact that scientific articles are curated and validated. And so this brings some level of trust in the content. It's not a perfect process, and your own judgment as a reader is still needed. Retractions and corrections can and do happen, and the system can be gamed by bad actors if editors and publishers take their eye off the ball. But this is the best that we have for now. So when you submit your article, you found the journal that most reflects what you are trying to do as a researcher, the one where you're seeing your peers and your perhaps your mentor or other people that you admire publish there, you're familiar with the community. So you've chosen this journal, you're going to submit to it, and there are usually several layers of assessment that will then happen. So this starts with the in-house staff, and that's the administrative checking to make sure you've submitted an actual paper and not your shopping list. And so that the various ethical and reporting guidelines have been adhered to, and so on and so on. And then it would typically be passed on to the academic editor for what we call desk assessment. So academic editors are usually working academics or researchers themselves. And so they do this on a volunteer basis, but they are, from my experience, extremely committed to the research appearing to the standards of their journal and to making sure that they're being fair in what they do. So they will assess the manuscript to make sure that it's suitable for the journal. They'll think about things like if it fits the scope, if it meets their expectations in terms of advance and interest, if they have the board coverage, the appropriate expertise within the board to be able to review it too. So they may reject at this stage, or they will invite peer reviewers to assess it. So this is the happy day in which point you find out that your manuscript is going on to review. Unhappy day is that this can take a little bit of time. And the reason for this is there are so many articles out there. Reviewers' time and energy is quite stretched. And so it could be difficult to find somebody who has both the necessary expertise and is able to do this review of your paper within a reasonable time period. So for my journals, it typically takes around 8 invitations to secure 2 reviewers. And this takes place over definitely a few weeks. The highest number of invitations that somebody sent out this year, an editor sent out, was 47. So it can be a very quick process, it can be a very slow process, depending on the particulars of the manuscript and of the editor. So patience is warranted, which definitely we understand is pretty difficult when you pour your hours and hours of work into something and you want to find out if it's going forward. But that's usually what's going on behind the scenes. So 2 or sometimes more reviewers will then assess the manuscript and make a recommendation about whether they feel it's publishable or not. And the editor will read the manuscript and decide whether to ask for revisions, reject, or accept for publications. It's worth mentioning at this decision stage that if you're not rejected at this point, it is very typical to have revisions. In fact, it's a lot more typical for your manuscript to be revised than for it just to be accepted. So don't be surprised if it comes back with either minor revisions or major revisions. Either way, it's a great sign. It still means your work is moving through the process. So then at that point, you are looking at the reviewer's comments, and you are, typically what we advise people to do is be hard to read reviewer comments depending on how generous they are, how blunt they are, how warranted you might feel they are. But we do recommend, you just receive your reviewer comments, maybe you put your paper away for a few days, and those reviewer comments to the side and just give it a few days and then go back to it and then revisit. And even if you're not incorporating every single suggestion that the reviewer has recommended, you want to be responding in some capacity. So you want to be responding to the report with an indication that you have considered the recommendation and that you've made the decision to do X, or you have made the decision to not do X, but there is a reasoning behind it. So then at this point, you've revised your manuscript, you put it back into the system, it'll go through the check again, just briefly, and then it will probably just go straight to the editors handling the manuscript, and they may actually look at the revisions, and they have the capacity in some cases to decide that your paper has met what the reviewers asked for, that it's ready to be published, hopefully accepted, and that it can then go out for publication. Sometimes if the editor feels they don't have the necessary expertise or they're not quite sure, they may send it again to reviewers just to have a quick look at it. So hopefully your manuscript is accepted at that point, and then the publishing staff will take over and get the manuscript ready for publication. So organizing typesetting, proofreading, indexing it, and making it searchable in databases. So how do you choose a journal when you are thinking about how to publish? There are many aspects that researchers can take into account when deciding where to submit. And these can include things they already know about the journal from experience, from their own research, from word of mouth with other people in your lab or in your department, as well as direct measurables like page charges, how much is it going to cost to publish the article, as well as metrics such as impact factor. So just looking at these, again, maybe we can get, how do we do this virtually? I'll read off the factors, and if you want to put your hand up or if you want to react to the top factor, that would be great. So when you're looking at a journal, how many of you consider journal scope to be the top factor? Availability to readers. Cost. Metrics like impact factor. Okay, interesting. Editor reputation. Alignment with my value. And time taken to receive a decision. Okay. So for those of you who chose impact factor, did you want to share the reasons why you're thinking about that factor as being the most important above all? No? Someone in the back has their hand up. Thanks, Nadia.
Thanks. I'm a librarian, but I see a lot of faculty who choose where to publish with regards to promotion and tenure decisions, especially junior faculty who are working towards putting their tenure package together. It's often important in those departments to publish in the most prestigious journals that they can, and often metrics like impact factor and others are considered to be indicators of prestige.
Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely. I mean, you've expressed kind of what the dominant view is. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with impact factor, I do have a slide. It's at the very back of my deck. So let me just go to it quickly. I'm going to get a tour of my presentation before I actually go in there. So, you know. Just one sec. I promise it's not going to take that long to get through this. So it is true that impact factor is definitely a factor, and it's something that tenure review committees are still looking at. There is a movement, particularly with NSERC, the National Sciences Research and Engineering Council, and other groups to move away from impact factor. Some of the reasons is, well, the main reason I think is that looking at impact factor and not considering any other factors in the journal tends to skew perhaps where you might be. It tends to skew your decision a little bit. So impact factor, it's a tool that was initially designed to aid librarians in journal purchasing decisions, prioritizing content volume over research quality. And the way that it's done, you can see by that formula, is that you are taking the number of citable items published in a given year. So for 2025, impact factor will be everything published in 2024 for a given journal. Or I'm sorry, everything published in 2022 for a given journal. And then they will count up the number of citations those articles received in 2023 and 2024. And they will divide the latter by the former. So the citations divided by the number of citable items. But what we tend to see happen, though, is often with the big journals, you will get a few different articles that have been authored by quote unquote superstars. And so you end up with a little bit of a skewed practice. So I think folks in the publishing industry, and certainly from different libraries that we've been to, are beginning to wonder if the impact factor is the best or the only metric that everybody should be using. While I think at the same time taking into account that researchers do need some sort of a guide to be able to determine, how quote unquote impactful the research is. Yeah. So if you have any more questions about the impact factor, I'm happy to address them after, but it is a little bit of a work in progress in terms of we want impact factor to be, if that is something the research community takes into account, we want that to be the case, but we also want people to begin thinking about publishing in terms of a more audience-based, community-based way of disseminating their work. And sometimes if you have work that is particular to a certain discipline, you can actually get more views and potentially more citations if you submit it to a smaller journal that focuses on that subset rather than the big journal in the field. It all depends on your work. So I'm just going to go back to where I was before. All right. So when you are submitting your article, good reporting and clarity of presentation can make it easier for the journal staff and the editors to see what you've done, as well as being more transparent for your readers. So a lot of these are obvious practices. So things like checking the journal website, making sure that the journal has the article type that you're wanting to submit, whether it's a review or a communication or so forth. And you followed instructions to the letter about formatting. The author list. This is something that we often get questions about. All authors must meet the criteria for authorship and should agree to the content of the paper. A very good resource for this, if you are uncertain, can be found with the not-for-profit MISO, and it is called the Contributor Role Taxonomy or Credit. So I know the librarians here will be familiar with that probably, but I will just pop it in the chat for you. And that gives you a useful overview of the various roles that can be credited and what order they would typically be credited. Following reporting guidelines appropriate to your research, including flowcharts and so forth. And data deposition. So if you deposit your data in a public repository, which may be mandatory, make sure that you state that in your manuscript or in the cover letter. This is a good thing. Typically, we're finding journals are more and more open to the idea of having data available because it makes the research more replicable, of course. And Canadian Science Publishing has a new partnership that we're trying out with an agency called Dryad. And that enables researchers who publish with a few of our journals to be able to submit their data to Dryad and to link to it to make it more accessible, which is usually is always good. Ethics and consent, if your research is on humans and animals, mentioned in the ethical approvals. This will be in the author guidelines. Conflict of interest, again, it should be listed in the author guidelines to declare any conflicts of interest that are inherent to your paper. Most of the time, these won't preclude publication. So things like, editors that you have a relationship with and so forth, you can state them in this section. Plagiarism, don't recycle text from others or from your own previous work without proper attribution, including AI text from tools like ChatGPT. Copyright, if you're reusing any visuals or audio, you may need to get permission. And submission, don't submit simultaneously to multiple journals. The reason that we ask you not to submit simultaneously has to do with the fragile nature of the scholarly publishing system. If authors were submitting simultaneously, there would be so many papers under review. There would be so many volunteer and even paid editors working that the system would just be overburdened and it would be impossible to proceed. So that's why we ask you. What are editors looking for? I mean, a lot of this should be fairly transparent at this point, but essentially you're making sure that right off the bat, either in your introduction or your cover letter or both, you are stating what your research is doing, what the conclusions are, and how it is making a contribution to your field, either big or small. So what previous work are you building upon? What's original or novel about the work? Or is the work confirmatory, and why is this important? I do have a couple of editors-in-chief who have explicitly said that they wish that they receive more submissions of negative or null results. Not everybody likes to write up negative or null results into a paper. It's, perhaps not as fun. But at the same time, it really is a contribution to the scholarly ecosystem in general, because others can see that your method, your attempt didn't work, which is hugely helpful. So you can always ask, this is a good question to ask. In fact, if you do have negative results that you think are worth publishing, reach out to the editor-in-chief and ask if they'd be interested in considering that. And often, they definitely would. Why is the topic of interest to readers of this journal? You don't need to go into too much detail about it, but you're making sure that in your statement, you're making it clear how this paper fits within the existing work and the existing readership that is around that particular journal. How are your results valuable to the wider research community? Again, just a gesture towards that. What impact will your research have on the discipline? We're kind of essentially getting into the same thing here. And as always with scientists in particular, but really with any researcher, you don't want to over exaggerate your findings. And you want to make it clear if you are, if your findings are contradicting existing work, or if you were building off existing work, you definitely want to make sure that it is cited, or even that it is described in the introduction that you're following this initial work. Peer review. So peer review is it is the foundation, of course, of research and scholarship. It's what differentiates academic journals from other forms of publications like preprints or blog posts or news articles. Rigorous peer review, it still is the best system that we have in scholarly publishing. I like to think of it as akin to democracy, not perfect, but really still the best system that we have. And to think, of peer review as being that form of gifting and community contribution that you're getting from other members of your field. In its best form, peer review is a conversation between academics that ideally is helping you refine your work. Rigorous peer review is necessary to combat fraudulent practices, certainly, and to prevent the publication of low quality research, definitely. Peer reviewers, when they are receiving a manuscript, they're typically looking for accuracy, timeliness, and appropriateness. So, they're checking to make sure that the work falls within the scope and whether the research topic has been clearly formulated and whether a suitable approach has been taken to address the scientific issues. And in its best form, it enhances quality, identifies errors, and facilitates collaboration. Unfortunately, because peer review is a human process that is done by flawed humans, which is part of what makes it great, it's also part of what can introduce drawbacks as well, which is, of course, related to bias in peer review. So this can be anything from institutional bias. What institution are you writing from? Confirmation bias, where your work may be more likely to be accepted if you are presenting work that they are inclined to agree with. Conflicts of interest do happen, cultural differences sometimes, and prejudices and that kind of thing certainly can happen as well. So as publishers, and definitely in partnership with the research community and certain research networks, we're looking at models of peer review that may help to improve quality and mitigate some of this. So the models of peer review that you typically see among scholarly publishers are, number one, the single anonymized peer review, which is the one that Canadian Science Publishing uses. And that's where the reviewers have access to author information but are anonymous to the author, usually to the readers. Then you have where in the second row, where everyone is incognito, you have double anonymized peer review, where the authors and reviewers are anonymous to each other. And the author information goes back up upon publication. And then the third way, which is, it's been around for a couple of decades, but it is only now growing in popularity, which is open peer review. And that's where the reviewers have access to author information. Authors have access to peer reviewer information at some point in the process, and reviewer identity and reports are available for readers upon publication. All right. So as an, I think that I'm just going to ask as an author, which form of peer review do you prefer? Among the group here, is there anyone who prefers open peer review as your primary model if you could choose any model that's out there? Okay, got one person. Single anonymous and double anonymous. One person. Interesting. Yeah, single anonymous. I think authors have a little bit of a concern that because their information is available and the reviewer information isn't, that it may be a little unequal, or there's introduces some anxiety, or perhaps those biases that we were talking about earlier. My experience has been, for the most part, that reviewers really do take the duties seriously, and that they'll try to put forth their best foot. But of course, you do see reviewers who are not taking it seriously, or can be overly harsh or critical in their comments. So that definitely does happen for sure. Open peer review, any comments on why open is your preferred form?
So one of the things that open peer review, I think, tries to do is have the speaker stand behind their statements by actually saying, I am this person, and here's my assessment of the article, and I'm putting my professional reputation in the mix of that review. So it can also help, I think, um, help the author in terms of understanding where the reviewer is coming from and what perspective and institution and experience they have in the field. And that may give more credence to the peer reviewer's comments.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. Definitely. I mean, one of the key reasons that certain groups are encouraging open peer review, not everybody, but certain groups, has to do with the fact, you know, as you say, that the reviewers are forced to present the reviewer comments as part of their own scholarly record. So that's both in terms of making sure that tend to get better quality reviews. It's also because potentially you can associate the record as a scholar, you know, if they have an ORCID author ID, which we recommend that people do have, you can send it here, is that they can associate those comments with their scholarly output and then potentially get credit from your institutions for doing this essential work. As publishers, we've experimented with things like paying reviewers. And we tend to find from what has happened is that when there's payment associated with the review, the quality of the review drops a little bit because you may not get the people that you want to be reviewing motivated to do the review. So definitely open review, it's going to take a while to catch on, and definitely it will catch on faster in certain disciplines than others, but there are clear benefits to it in terms of credit and payment for the reviewer, as well as additional value for the author too. The downside to open peer review is if you're a junior scholar and you're charged with reviewing a senior scholar's manuscript, you may not feel comfortable with being fully honest about the work, or you may feel that there are future retribution that could happen against you. So that's something that I think institutions as well as potentially publishers need to be involved in trying to find ways to mitigate that, depending on what's possible. Would double anonymous minimize bias the most compared to other methods? Are there any drawbacks to double anonymous? So there was an experiment recently in a journal called Ecology with double anonymous, and what they found out was, this was just one study, but they found that it didn't seem to minimize bias against the individual based on individual traits, but it did ensure publication was fair because the more senior researchers who were authors were a little bit less likely to have the publication accepted. So I'm not sure if that's, I mean, it is a little bit more fair and even, I suppose, but it didn't seem to have that initial bias effect that you think it would. So I'd be curious to see additional studies to see what happens. And maybe there will be additional studies that come out. Double anonymous tends to happen it's a common method in social sciences, humanities book publishing. It can be difficult to really make it double anonymous, especially in smaller fields. Once you read somebody's paper or their manuscript, it can be easy to identify them. So it's a work in progress, but yeah, definitely. I mean, really pros and cons to each of these for sure. All right. So you've submitted your paper. Hopefully it's accepted, which would be amazing. But unfortunately, you know, journal acceptance rates are around 20-30% depending. So your paper may be rejected. And again, you know, common reasons for rejecting: out of scope. So that will typically happen right away. Your methods are weak or flawed and results are unreliable. The paper has poor data analysis. Conclusions are not supported by the evidence. So these are related to the scientific soundness of the study. And ideally, if you have reviewer comments, you can then incorporate it into the paper and make your paper better for the next time around. Study ignores other potential interpretations of the data. Yeah, that can happen if you kind of have your blinkers on as an author and you're really excited about pursuing a certain method. sometimes you just won't see the other interpretations that are obvious to others. Quality of the language is poor, lacks clear and logical flow. This is where, the tried and true method of giving your paper to a friend who is outside your field can be really helpful to make sure they can basically understand how it progresses. And duplicate submission. So if we understand that the paper has been submitted to more than one journal, it would typically be accepted. Great. So returning back to how researchers choose where to publish, we're going to take a step back and narrow in on the factors that are pertinent to open access, even if they're not necessarily pertinent to everyone. So in a traditional publishing model, journals are available by subscription. So the university library pays to allow access to the content. Open access helps ensure wider availability to readers. It's been around for decades, and this is the model in which the costs of publication are paid either by the researcher, which is Gold OA, via partnership, or by another party where a journal is sponsored by a certain organization that covers the cost of publishing. And Diamond OA articles are less common, but definitely very, if you're in a community where you have a Diamond OA publication, you're very lucky to have it. Certainly there are costs associated with publishing. So even when the publisher is not for profit, these pay for things like staff costs, peer review administration, web hosting, not just now, but in perpetuity, indexing and databases and so forth. So the three terms, open science, open data, and open access. Of the three terms, open science is an umbrella term. So we're talking about making the outputs of scientific research available and discoverable for public use. UNESCO has a very inclusive definition there. And that includes how science can benefit society by engaging the broader community and facilitating communication among stakeholder groups. Because I work for the agriculture journals, for example, we find that we are always trying to communicate the results of what's published out into the industry. So people like agronomists and dairy farmers and farmer associations can benefit from that work. And so open science definitely helps them. And to do so not just within Canada, but across the world as well. Open access, this is the term that is associated with the publication itself. So sometimes you kind of hear the terms confused, but open access, we're talking about a publication that is made available to everybody, and it has a Creative Commons license attached to it. So Canadian Science Publishing uses a CC BY 4.0 license, which enables users to distribute, remix, adapt, and build upon a material in any medium or format, as long as attribution is given to the creator. So the license allows for commercial use, even as long as the creator is credited properly. We at Canadian Science Publishing, we have an open access glossary that does break down some of those terms. So there's the URL to that at the bottom. Do have a look, if you're interested in this kind of publishing, or you want to understand more, it's very helpful. And just again, with OA open in general, it's worth considering. There are so many debates around open access and how to pay for it and how to make sure that researchers are still able to publish, that we sometimes do need to focus in on the idea that OA is really a means to other ends to make sure that that research is sustainable and equitable and usable and so forth. So for all of you, are OA papers cited more often? They definitely are. This is seen across different fields and different journals, certainly, and they typically as well receive more diverse citations from different institutions and regions and fields and so forth. So that shows that the goal of OA is being achieved by expanding use of research and increasing the diversity of communities that benefit from it. And it is growing globally. The green bar here at the top of this chart, these are institutional repositories where a version is made OA. This is some researcher gold OA articles that have been paid for, and the black is closed access. So you can see it growing generally steadily over the past 10 years. And the reason that we do see this growing is that there are more and more international open access frameworks and national open access policies and funder policies that are pushing researchers to publish their research as open access right away. So most policies over the past 5 years have required that researchers must publish their funded research as open access by default immediately upon publication. In Canada, the main policy there is Canada's Tri-Agency Open Access Policy, which is the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council, or NSERC, SHRC, Social Sciences and Research, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR. So that policy, it has been under public engagement for quite a few months, and they are set to review the draft policy and release the final policy at the end of 2025. And at that point, we'll be able to determine whether we are indeed going ahead with what has been on the table for quite a while, which is that need for researchers to publish what has been publicly funded to make sure that it's publicly accessible. So at CSP, we're always thinking about ways that we can do this without making it prohibitive for researchers. So the way that we are moving forward, and that's been the case for many different publishers, is through partnerships in which libraries are supporting authors from their institution in publishing with certain journals or certain publishers with minimal to no fees, with the idea being that this should be basically kind of an umbrella of support for researchers so that they can continue to publish their work open access if they so choose. And so the typical OA routes that you have there, you have the gold and diamond OA, whereby there are processing charges that support that publication. You have the transformative agreements, which can support gold and diamond OA. The green OA is a little bit of an older form of open access, where the accepted version of the article is published in the repository, and this can be immediately available or with an embargo too. And the final open term is open data, and we're referring there to data that is freely available for anyone to access, use, modify, and share without barriers. As we're always thinking about, when you talk about open data, you want to make sure that in the context of doing it, making it open, that we should strive to recognize that not all data can be fully open and available. So I've had conversations with editors about this, and in some cases they feel that they would prefer that their data be used in ways that they understand, in ways, so they would prefer that people approach them with questions about the data and its context, so that they could provide a little bit of additional context, and so that they understand themselves how the data will then be used. So there's a little bit of a gray area there that I think as publishers will still navigating in terms of what makes sense. And then, of course, with open data, you always have to be aware that you may be vulnerable to bad actors as well, to people who will take your data and not credit it or will use it for purposes that it wasn't intended for. So again, exciting times in terms of what it means for data to be open, how useful this is, and whether it will advance science in all the ways that we hope it will. So we've got a couple slides to wrap up, but I do want to leave a few minutes for questions. So I think I'm just going to leave it here before we move on to questions. One thing to think about when you are publishing is that publishing is really a human process, just as research itself is a human process, and writing as well, for, for now at least, is still a human process. And many of the factors that make science trustworthy are the outcomes of community. So when we're thinking about community, we're thinking mostly about the journal's community, which is made up of all the different groups that are listed on this slide. And they can be working together towards common goals, including open access, but including as well the advancement of research and science. It's a fun field to be in too, because it is highly collaborative. In its best form, you have editors and reviewers collaborating with each other and with us, the publisher, to constructively critique scholarly outputs and improve their quality. We're always collaborating as well with academic societies that our journals are partnered with, and universities and libraries to better understand the needs of these groups. And we collaborate as well with industry stakeholders in publishing, so that we're staying up to date with best practices. We work with research networks to experiment with different forms of open publishing and open science. And we are fortunate to have various opportunities to collaborate with community on projects related to the integrative nature of scientific research and even community engaged research too. Yeah. So I'll skip over this question here. Yeah, so what can you do as a legitimate researcher who's thinking about publishing? Just a few tips before we finish up. Cultivate your complete public profile. Keep your ORCID ID up to date. Definitely go and get one. If you don't have one, it's free. And it helps consolidate the work that you are or will be publishing. Make sure that you keep your institutional web pages, your ResearchGate page, your LinkedIn up to date. This helps our ethical and integrity people ensure when you do submit a paper that you are who you say you are, and that we can kind of see that background of the different publications that you've been working on, and that they're all more or less within the same field. Use your institutional email if available. We know that you will progress in your career from graduate student to postdoc, and then potentially to whatever career that you go into. That's fine, but institutional email is another thing that helps us determine that you are who you say you are as a researcher. Document your data, we talked about that. And there's a few links here to various sites that talk about some of the issues that we're facing today in science publishing, and some of the initiatives that are underway to solve some of those, and to really make science publishing a space that we hope will support researchers and will support the scholarly publishing ecosystem for years to come. So thank you. I have a few questions, but I think what I will do is just kind of leave it open to general questions if people have them, or if you're interested in talking about related topics, now is your time to jump in.